The Gulfstream jet sliced through the clouds like a silver arrow, its engines humming with a quiet authority that only the wealthy knew intimately. Inside, the world was an entirely different universe. Polished leather seats, crystal glasses resting in holders, the faint aroma of imported champagne lingering in the pressurized air. To most, this was luxury beyond imagination. To her, it was simply another day at 30,000 feet. She was the owner of the jet, a black woman whose presence commanded both respect and curiosity wherever she went. Graceful in movement, calm in tone, yet sharp enough in her eyes to remind anyone that power was not something handed to her. It was something she had built, brick by brick, against the resistance of a world that never expected her to rise. Tonight, she was not just traveling. She was observing. She was measuring the people around her, the employees she had trusted to represent her name and her empire. Before we go any further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you powerful stories like this one. The flight attendant moved briskly, tray in hand, lips pressed tight in the way of someone trying to mask irritation. Her steps carried the kind of energy that passengers often overlooked, but the CEO noticed. She noticed everything, from the way the attendant avoided direct eye contact, to the sharpness in her voice when she asked the black woman if she wanted anything to drink. It wasn't service. It was tolerance dipped in disdain. Minutes passed, and then it happened. Something so unexpected, so raw, that silence fell over the cabin like a curtain being drawn. The flight attendant leaned closer, her tone shifting from strained politeness to open disrespect. Words clashed, tempers flared, and before anyone could stop it, the attendant's hand snapped forward, striking the black CEO across the face with a sharp, deliberate slap. For a moment, time froze. The hum of the engines seemed to vanish. The other passengers held their breath, and the attendant's own eyes widened as though even she hadn't fully realized what she had just done. But the CEO did not rise, nor shout, nor crumble. She simply sat still, her hand slowly lifting to the side of her cheek, her gaze locked on the woman who had dared to touch her. It was in that stillness that the temperature of the cabin changed, because what the attendant didn't know, what almost no one on that flight understood in that moment, was that she hadn't just struck a passenger. She had slapped the owner of the jet, the very woman whose signature paid every single paycheck, including hers. And 10 minutes later, the decision that would shock them all began to form. The air in the cabin turned heavy, so heavy that even the steady thrum of the engines couldn't break it. The passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending to look away, others caught in the impossible grip of disbelief. A slap, on a private jet, against a woman of her stature? It was unheard of, inconceivable. Yet it had happened, right before their eyes. The CEO remained motionless, her fingers lightly grazing the cheek where the sting still lingered. But her eyes, those eyes carried a calm that unsettled everyone. They were not the eyes of someone broken, nor the eyes of someone humiliated. They were the eyes of someone calculating, someone who, with one silent stare, could dismantle the world of the person who dared to cross her. The flight attendant swallowed hard, the weight of her actions crashing in too late. She tried to busy herself, rearranging glasses on the tray, muttering under her breath as though noise could erase the memory of the slap. But her hands trembled, betraying the fear that now coursed through her veins. The CEO shifted slightly, crossing her legs, her voice finally cutting through the suffocating silence. 10 minutes, she said softly, almost like a whisper, but every soul on board heard it. No one understood what she meant, not yet, but the way she said it made hearts pound faster, as though a clock had suddenly been set, counting down to something inevitable. Her team, seated a few rows back, exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen her angry before, seen her dismiss competitors with a single phone call, seen her command boardrooms with steel in her voice. But this was different. There was no yelling, no outburst, no wild reaction. Only precision, only certainty. The attendant dared to speak, her voice laced with forced confidence. "You don't scare me," she said, though her words cracked in the middle. "People like you think you can just—" But the CEO raised her hand gently, silencing her without a word. And once again, the hush returned, thicker than before. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, torn between witnessing history and wishing to disappear. Because everyone knew deep down, the flight might have still been in the air. But the attendant's career, her life as she knew it, was already nosediving toward the ground. 10 minutes. That was all the CEO had given her. And as the minutes ticked away, the atmosphere on board grew electric with suspense. Something was coming. Something that would shock them all. The first minute slipped by in silence. The CEO sat still, her posture regal, her fingers tapping once against the armrest as though keeping rhythm with the ticking clock in her head. Across the aisle, her assistant glanced nervously, wondering if she should intervene. But one look at her boss's expression told her everything. Stay seated. Watch. Learn. By the third minute, the flight attendant's bravado began to crumble. She busied herself unnecessarily, folding napkins, adjusting the angle of a water bottle, tightening the strap of the service cart. But nothing could erase the sound of that slap. It echoed in her mind, colliding against the deafening silence of a woman who refused to rise, refused to yell, refused to make a scene. That silence was more dangerous than any outburst. By the fifth minute, whispers stirred among the passengers. A businessman leaned toward his wife, muttering, "Do you know who that is? That's her jet. Her company's jet." The words spread like wildfire, filling the cabin with realization. One by one, the pieces clicked in their minds. The slap had not landed on a mere passenger. It had landed on power itself. The attendant's face paled, the sweat beginning to beat at her hairline. Her throat tightened as she tried to swallow. Each second was a reminder of what she had done. Each second was the sound of a clock striking closer to doom. By the 8th minute, the CEO finally leaned forward, resting her elbows gently on her knees. Her eyes locked on the attendant, and her voice, low but firm, cut through the cabin. "Do you know what arrogance looks like at 30,000 feet?" she asked. The attendant's lips parted, but no sound came. She was trapped between fear and pride, unsure which one would consume her first. The CEO continued, her words deliberate. "It looks like a hand raised in hatred, a hand raised against the very one who signs your checks. And arrogance, my dear, comes with a cost." The 9th minute struck. Passengers held their breath, knowing the 10th would bring something none of them would forget. The CEO reclined slowly, almost casually, her eyes never leaving the trembling attendant. And then, the 10th minute arrived. The CEO lifted her hand, not in anger, but in command. A single wave, subtle but absolute. Her assistant rose immediately, phone already in hand. Calls were about to be made. Contracts were about to be severed. Careers were about to end. The attendant, frozen in her place, realized too late that her fate was sealed. The slap she had delivered would cost her not just this job, but would unravel the careers of everyone complicit in the arrogance that had festered around her. The storm had arrived. The CEO's assistant pressed the phone to her ear, her voice low but steady, echoing the authority she carried on behalf of her boss. "Terminate the contracts, every single one tied to this flight crew, effective immediately." Her words were sharp, clean, merciless. Gasps rippled through the cabin. One of the male attendants at the back jolted upright, his face blanching. "Wait, what? You can't just—" But the CEO's gaze snapped to him, silencing him instantly. "You thought arrogance was safe under my roof?" she said, her voice even. "You thought I wouldn't notice the sideways glances, the whispered remarks, the way you tolerated her behavior because she carried it out for all of you?" The cabin fell quiet again. The attendants stood frozen, no longer staff, but statues awaiting their sentence. The flight attendant, who had delivered the slap, pressed her shaking hands against the service cart. "Please," she whispered. Her tone had shifted from defiance to desperation. I didn't mean—" The CEO cut her off, her words slicing through like ice. "You meant every ounce of it. A hand does not rise on accident. It rises from the soil of contempt, watered by years of hate, emboldened by the silence of those who stood beside you." The passengers watched, transfixed, as the CEO leaned back, lifting her champagne glass with an elegance that contrasted violently against the destruction she was orchestrating. She didn't sip. It wasn't about the drink. It was about showing the world that she was not rattled, not broken, not even inconvenienced. Her assistant nodded into the phone, then looked back. It's done. Contracts dissolved, effective as of this moment. A heavy silence draped over the crew. Jobs that had taken years to secure were gone in seconds. Reputations, privileges, access to wealth, all vanished at the wave of a hand. The CEO placed her glass gently on the table before her, her voice calm. You will land this plane, and when the doors open, you will not represent me, my company, or my name ever again. You have 10 minutes to sit quietly and reflect on what arrogance cost you. The slap had been the spark, but the fire now consumed an entire team. And yet, in her eyes, this wasn't punishment. This was balance. A lesson written not in rage, but in consequence. The jet continued to slice through the clouds, but inside, the altitude felt different. Higher for some, crushing for others. And in that moment, every passenger realized, this wasn't just about a slap. This was about power, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't fight, but simply decides. The cabin was silent except for the soft drone of the engines. A silence so sharp it carved through every passenger's thoughts. Some shifted uncomfortably in their leather seats, clutching their glasses a little tighter, afraid to make a sound that might draw attention. Others simply stared, their faces pale, as though they just witnessed a corporate execution. The flight attendant who had delivered the slap sat trembling, her lips pressed together to hold back sobs. She tried to steady her breathing, but every inhale rattled, every exhale shook. Her entire world, her job, her security, her reputation, was collapsing in real time. She had thought she was untouchable in the sky, but now she realized she had slapped the sky itself, and the sky had struck back with thunder. One of the passengers, a middle-aged businessman with sharp features, finally found the courage to speak. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, addressing the CEO, "with all respect, perhaps dismissal is too harsh. She made a mistake. Surely." The CEO turned her gaze on him, and he stopped mid-sentence. Her expression wasn't cruel, but it held the weight of someone who had heard excuses her entire life. Excuses for behavior that should never have been tolerated. "Mistakes," she said quietly, "are spilled water. They are forgotten words. They are accidents without intent. This was not a mistake. This was a choice, and choices have consequences." Her words settled over the cabin like scripture. Undeniable, unshakable. The businessman lowered his head, chastened, understanding that this was not a matter to debate. The rest of the team sat frozen, watching their futures unravel. One attendant whispered under his breath, "My family. What am I going to tell them?" Another clenched his fists, staring down at the carpet, rage and fear battling behind his eyes. But none dared speak louder than a whisper. The CEO's assistant typed furiously on her tablet, sending directives, locking accounts, stripping access. With each stroke, the ties between these employees and the company dissolved like threads cut by a sharp blade. The CEO leaned back, her calm never faltering, her voice even. "When I built this company, I did it knowing every eye was waiting for me to fail. Every door I opened, I had to push twice as hard because of my gender, because of my color, because people like her believed I didn't belong in rooms like these, or skies like this. So no," she said firmly, her tone cutting through the weight in the room. "This isn't just about me. It's about every woman, every man, every person who has been told they are less. And if I must fire an entire team to make the point that contempt will never wear my company's uniform, then so be it." The passengers shifted again, but this time not out of discomfort, out of respect. What they had just witnessed was not a breakdown. It was a declaration. The fallout had begun, but the lesson, the message, was only just unfolding. The descent began quietly, the jet tilting ever so slightly as the engines lowered their pitch. Seatbelts clicked as passengers strapped in, but their eyes never left the woman at the front. She sat calm, unbothered, like a queen returning to her throne after passing judgment. Her composure only deepened the unease rippling through the cabin. The flight attendant, who had slapped her now, sat crumpled in a seat, her head bowed, her hands trembling in her lap. Every second closer to the ground felt like another nail in her career's coffin. The others whispered in hushed tones, desperate, terrified, wondering if there was any way to undo what had been done. But the CEO's silence was louder than any plea. Through the window, the runway lights glimmered, stretching like a river of gold across the dark. The jet touched down smoothly, rubber screeching against tarmac. But inside, hearts pounded as though crashing instead of landing. The team knew their fates were sealed, but they didn't yet realize the extent. The CEO rose from her seat with the slow grace of someone who controlled the room by simply existing. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed the folds of her trousers, and waited as the jet rolled to a gentle stop near a private terminal. Her assistant stood ready, phone still in hand, eyes sharp with efficiency. When the door finally opened, the first thing the staff saw was not freedom, but a wall of suited figures waiting outside. Company executives, legal representatives, security. The world they had thought belonged to them for years now stared back with cold detachment. The CEO stepped forward first, her heels striking the steps with precision. The night air greeted her, cool and crisp, but behind her trailed the weight of what had just unfolded. Every passenger followed slowly, whispering among themselves, their eyes filled with the awe of witnesses who knew they had seen history in motion. Then came the attendants, their faces drained of color, their bodies stiff with dread. The one who had slapped her hesitated at the door, staring into the crowd below as if the ground itself had turned hostile. She descended reluctantly, her legs heavy, her pride shattered. At the bottom of the stairs, the CEO turned to her assistant and said only one word. Now. Papers were handed out, official notices, termination letters, contracts shredded in the most public way possible, right there on the tarmac under the floodlights. The attendants protested weakly, some begging, some angry, but the sound of their words fell flat against the quiet authority of the woman they had underestimated. The world outside the jet moved as usual. Luggage carts humming, pilots checking their instruments, fuel trucks rolling by. But in that small pocket of space, lives were ending, futures were dissolving, and the truth of power was unfolding for all to see. And the CEO, she didn't raise her voice once. She didn't gloat. She didn't humiliate. She simply enforced, calm, unwavering, resolute. Because this was never about revenge. This was about principle, and the ground had only just begun to feel the tremors of her decision. The airport lights glowed bright against the night sky, casting long shadows across the tarmac. But those shadows felt heavier now, as if they carried with them the weight of lessons too long ignored. The flight attendants, stripped of their uniforms and dignity, stood shivering in the cool air. Their voices faltered, each excuse sounding smaller than the last. Some swore they hadn't meant it. Others claimed it was a misunderstanding, but none of it mattered. The CEO never once looked back at them. She walked toward a black sedan waiting nearby, her assistant matching her pace. And in that silence, something became frighteningly clear. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply walks away, leaving behind a trail of broken arrogance. Passengers who had been silent witnesses whispered to one another as they filed into the terminal. Phones came out, messages flew across continents. Within minutes, stories began spreading through hushed calls and private group chats. Did you see what just happened? Do you know who she really was? My God, they slapped their own CEO. The ripple had begun. By morning, it would no longer be whispers. It would be headlines. Companies thrive on image, on reputation, on the delicate threads of trust woven between leadership and employees. But tonight, that thread had been torn apart before dozens of eyes. Inside the terminal, the attendants' replacements were already waiting, fresh-faced, respectful, trained to serve with dignity. They greeted the CEO with deep bows, guiding her through a private corridor with unwavering courtesy. And as the old staff looked on, discarded and humiliated, they finally understood the depth of their mistake. They hadn't just disrespected a passenger, they had disrespected the hand that fed them, the very foundation that kept them employed. Still, the CEO showed no visible anger, no satisfaction. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than rage, sharper than vengeance. because the punishment wasn't in what she did, it was in what she didn't need to do. The attendant's own actions had become their executioner. Their downfall was authored by their own arrogance. That night, somewhere between the echo of her heels on marble floors and the quiet hum of the waiting car, one truth burned itself into memory. Respect is not given to uniforms, ranks, or titles. Respect belongs to humanity itself. Lose sight of that, and you lose everything. And while the attendants would wake tomorrow to unemployment and public shame, the CEO would wake to an empire still intact, stronger than ever, with the loyalty of those who had seen her patience, her restraint, and her unshakable poise. The ripples had started on a jet. By dawn, they would spread across the world. The sun had barely risen when the first headline appeared. A small blog post, written by a passenger who had witnessed it all, went live just after dawn. The words were simple, but their effect was seismic. Flight attendants fired on the spot after slapping black. CEO on her own jet. At first, it was disbelief. How could such a thing happen? But soon came the photos. Grainy images from cell phones, blurry but undeniable. A woman being struck, a young girl crying, and then the unmistakable profile of the CEO walking away as attendants were escorted off the tarmac. By noon, the story had leapt from blogs to major news networks. Anchors spoke with hushed voices, eyes wide with the gravity of it. Panels debated not just the incident, but what it symbolized: arrogance, prejudice, the dangerous blindness of underestimating someone because of skin color. Every hour, the story grew teeth. Hashtags trended, clips circulated, social media erupted into a wildfire of anger and disbelief. "How dare they?" wrote one user. "This isn't just disrespect, it's violence." Another tweeted, "That CEO handled it with more grace than I ever could. That's real power." And then came the pressure. The airline's headquarters lit up with calls and emails. Shareholders demanded explanations. Customers threatened boycotts. In the boardroom, executives sat pale-faced, shuffling papers with trembling hands. They hadn't even known their CEO had boarded the flight. They hadn't expected the scandal to crash through their doors like a tidal wave. And now the empire they had built on polish and prestige was crumbling under the weight of a single slap. Meanwhile, the CEO said nothing. Not a word to the press. Not a single public statement. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Because she knew the world didn't need her outrage. The truth was loud enough on its own. But behind closed doors, she worked quietly. Meetings were called, teams were reshuffled, loyalty was tested, and one by one, those who had looked the other way when disrespect brewed found themselves replaced by people who understood the value of humility and integrity. The young maid's daughter, the girl who had been struck, was brought into the CEO's private residence later that evening. There she was embraced, not just by the CEO, but by an entire household that treated her as family. She smiled again, shy but safe, and in that smile, the CEO found the only vindication she needed. The storm outside roared louder with each passing hour, but inside her walls there was peace, because storms don't last forever. But the lessons they leave behind, those echo for lifetimes. For days, the world spoke louder than the woman at the center of it. Headlines spun, debates raged, and speculation filled every silence. Yet through it all, the CEO remained quiet, steady as stone in a storm. And then, on the fifth morning, she appeared. The cameras clicked furiously as she stepped onto the podium, her tailored black suit absorbing the lights, her posture unshaken. She looked neither angry nor broken. She looked resolute. The room hushed. The world held its breath. Her voice, when it came, was calm, low, firm. "Respect," she said, "is the simplest form of humanity. And yet, too often it is denied to those who appear powerless." But let this incident serve as a reminder. No one who builds their power on disrespect will keep it. Reporters leaned forward, pens trembling. She didn't rant. She didn't rage. She spoke as if to a classroom of children, teaching them truths too often forgotten. She spoke of her company's values, of how arrogance blinds and prejudice poisons. She spoke of dignity, not just hers, but the dignity of every worker, every child, every person who ever felt lesser because of someone else's pride. The world saw what happened, she continued, her gaze steady, and the world has judged. But my concern is not vengeance. It is prevention. We cannot change the past, but we can demand a better future. Her words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward, striking deep into the hearts of those who listen. When she finished, she didn't wait for applause. She simply stepped down, leaving silence in her wake, a silence more powerful than any roar. That silence traveled across continents, across screens, across the minds of people who would never again forget the image of a young girl struck down and a woman rising up without hate in her eyes, only truth. And slowly the storm quieted. Not because people forgot, but because they remembered, because her message had settled into the marrow of society itself. In boardrooms, in schools, in homes, people repeated her words. Respect is the simplest form of humanity, a phrase that outlived the scandal, a phrase that grew into a creed. The flight attendants who had once smirked with arrogance were left jobless, nameless, drifting in the shadow of their mistake. But the CEO, she didn't just emerge unscathed, she emerged immortal in reputation. Because history doesn't remember those who lash out in rage, it remembers those who stand tall in grace. And on that day, the world remembered her. Weeks passed. The headlines that once screamed in red letters faded to black and white. The noise of scandal died down, replaced by the steady hum of progress. Yet the story never truly disappeared. It lingered like a lesson carved into stone. The CEO continued her work, not with vengeance, but with vision. She poured resources into diversity training across her empire. She funded scholarships for young women of color entering aviation. And she made sure the maid's daughter, the child who had borne the cruelty of arrogance, would never again face such indignity. That little girl was placed in the best schools, her future lit brighter than those who had once tried to dim it. Behind her walls, life grew warm again. Laughter filled the halls. The young girl's smile became a reminder of resilience, and the CEO herself became a living symbol of strength without hatred, of power without cruelty. And the world, oh, the world remembered. In airports, passengers now thought twice before looking down on the uniforms that served them. In offices, executives whispered the story as a warning. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never mistake humility for weakness. Because one single night, one single slap, had rewritten the meaning of respect. And the CEO, she carried on. Not as a victim, not even as a victor, but as a reminder that dignity is the greatest power of all. The storm had passed. The lesson remained. And before we close this chapter, remember, every story we share carries a lesson worth holding close. If this one moved you, let it be a spark. Carry its weight, pass it on, and never forget, respect costs nothing, but it changes everything. If you believe stories like this should be told, hit that subscribe button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below because your voice matters too.